Most people think of Git as a versioning system for code, but it turns out that it's also incredibly powerful as a data persistence layer for the web. My name is Jen Weber, and I'm an engineer at Cardstack working to make Web 3.0 usable for everyone. In this video for developers, we'll walk through how to set up a local and remote Git repository that holds data for cards. I'll also share why the Git plugin is one of my favorite features of the Card SDK. First, you need to make a card. If you've never done this before, you can check out our other videos and guides for step-by-step instructions. You'll need to have a card in order to do the rest of the tutorial, and you should have set up your mock login user edit button as well as the grants. So I'll show you really quickly what I've set up here. I've got a card called Photo. It has two fields on it, title and photographer. I have the grants that I need in order to use the mock login user. And I have the mock login user included in my application.hbs file right here. Next, let's take a look at the data sources being used in our project. The data sources define where data should be saved for each type of card. For example, one card might use Git, another might use S3, and another might save its data to the blockchain. This project is using the ephemeral data source for its default. That means any new cards that get created are going to be automatically assigned to the ephemeral source, but if we wanted to, we could configure them one card at a time to use something else. So I want to change my default to be a local Git repository instead. So let's go ahead and change this to Git. And I need to tell Git where to find that GitHub repository. So we're going to make something called demo data and keep our data there. So let's go ahead and make that repository. Once we do this, our card data will be saved on this computer while we're working. I'm going to run git init inside my new demo data directory. Then I'm going to create a file and commit it. That way my repository has an initial commit, which is needed in order for commits to be made to master. So let's go ahead and start up our application. I'll click the Edit Content button to open up the right edge. I'll click the plus button to create something new, and let's make a photo. I'll hit save. And if I look at my console, I'll see that a post went out to the API endpoint for my photos. Let's run git status in our data repository to see what happened. So we can see here that some changes have been made. And if we look at them, we can actually see a JSON representation of our card data. Let's go ahead and make one more change. I'm going to add my last name here and save. Now we can see that the photographer name has changed to my full name. And if we do git log, we can see that some changes have been made to the data. So if I wanted to ever go back and see what the data for this card looked like across time, maybe it was in a record that was really important to my business, I can find all of that information here. So we've covered using a local Git repository, but what about if you wanted to use a remote repository, such as on GitHub? Maybe you want to use this in production. Maybe you want to share this testing data with your colleagues. The Card SDK's Git plugin can do that too. So let's go ahead and set that up. I'm going to go to my GitHub. I'll click the plus button to make a new repository. I'm going to call it demo data. I'm going to leave it public. This means anyone in the world could see the data that I send up. And I'm going to initialize it with a README. So I'll create this repository. Great, it exists. Now let's go ahead and configure our data sources to start using this instead of our local repository. So the changes that we make here are, instead of specifying a repo, We're going to specify a remote. It needs to know where your private Git key is, and it needs to know the URL of your Git repository. So let's go ahead and fill those things in. Now, a private key is something that you should never commit to your Git repository. It's something that you should never share with anyone else, because if someone has the private key to your GitHub, that means they could do anything. They could read your code, they could delete it, they could destroy stuff, they could inject malicious code into the projects that you're working on. You don't want that. So it's really important to never hard code your private key. So what I'm going to use instead is an environmental variable that I've already set that contains my private key. So I'm going to restart my server because I made changes to some of the static model things. Every time you make changes to those low-level configurations, it's a good idea to restart your app. Let's create a card. We'll hit save. And now this data is getting set to our remote Git repository. Let's refresh over here and see what's happened. Great, so we can actually see that we have a fresh commit made to this repository. We can look inside of this file and actually see that our data is here as JSON. So let's do the same thing we did before. Let's make another change. So I'm going to add to Vermont, and I'll hit save. All right, let's look again at our card record. We can see here that it has been updated, and if we want to, we can even have a look at the history and see which things changed when. So I can see the difference here that to Vermont got added. This is really powerful when you're dealing with things like business data, where knowing what has changed across time is important. Being able to roll back is important. And for that reason, the Git plugin is one of my favorite features of the Card SDK. I, as a developer, don't have to build a system that keeps this history of edits by myself. Git does it for me. And in cases where you're building something that needs a data source that's maintained by many parties, this kind of history is a must-have. So like, for example, let's say 3 different companies need to be able to use the same database. With the Git plugin plus the GitHub Auth plugin, everyone can see the changes made and who made them. And you get it for free when you're using the Card SDK. To learn more, check out our guides at docs.cardstack.com and have a look at our open source code bases on GitHub. Thanks for listening.